Hi, I'm Steve Balch, Director of the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization here at Texas Tech, and I'd like to welcome you to another of our Institute Encounters, in which we interview our distinguished scholarly visitors and find out all sorts of things above and beyond what they're going to talk about when they lecture on our campus. And of course, you can also see on the same website the lectures as well. And today, our very distinguished guest is Dr. James Caesar, and he is professor of politics at the University of Virginia, author of a dozen books, all of which are notable, but the most notable ones are Reconstructing America, which is a kind of European view of what the American experiment was all about, and Presidential Selection, which I gather is a series of books.
Presidential Selection was my dissertation.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Recast, of course, and redone, and that was my first book.
But you've brought out a whole series of books about each presidential election since 1992?
Yes.
Okay, right up to the present, right up to
2016.
To the real blockbuster of presidential elections.
2000 maybe was just as good.
Okay.
They had a lot of similarities in their excitement, but those were the two best sellers.
So the 2016 election, really one that in many respects was quite off the charts, like none that had come before. I think our viewers will know what the result was, but beyond that, what was so staggering about this particular election?
Well, I think, first of all, for the fact that on election night, the outcome was an upset, and for which very few were prepared. I recall coming home that evening, hearing the early reports before the polls had actually closed from the exit polls, and it seemed like Hillary was in charge. I accidentally fell asleep, and I woke up at 12:30 hearing the commentators say, "There's a slight chance that Hillary could win, but it's very doubtful." I felt like Rip Van Winkle. I had entered into another age and simply couldn't believe what had happened. I thought it was that Hillary had a much better chance of winning, though in scholarly fashion I'd point out to my students that there was always a possibility that Donald Trump could be the victor. So that was, I think, the astounding thing. And it took a while for everyone to get beyond that and to realize what the outcome of the election meant in the early phases, that this group that to which Trump appealed, let's call it the more Midwest or working class type of voters throughout this western Pennsylvania, but Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and the like, that they now represented the presidential majority. And if they were forgotten before, as they had been completely by the Democratic Party in many respects, those had been the common people that Roosevelt had appealed to, and they dropped off the charts for the Democratic Party, except for a few programs that were proposed. And we're at the fringes of the Republican Party, that group now is going to be a much more important force in American politics, or at least that it has to be recognized as the core supporter of President Trump.
So do you think that the American political landscape is in some fundamental way now changed?
I think it is, in the sense that this group, to which I refer, called the populist element, what Hillary called the deplorables, however you want to refer to it, had been ignored inside the scope of American politics. And the scope of American politics was more or less a debate or an encounter between two types of coastal elites, with the others, as the phrase goes, in flyby country, flyover country, who had been ignored. And here you have this election victory, and no matter how it turns out, no matter what Trump does, how successful, everyone realizes that this is the case, that this group now has to be looked at. Novels like Vance's book on hillbilly elegy appear, and this now becomes a thing that people have to look at. So you even have the extraordinary example of some people from New York or Los Angeles leaving their coastal pedestals and coming into the hinterland, maybe for just a few days at a select diner here and there, but they knew that they had to recognize it and couldn't forget it completely.
Well, that's why we've invited you here to Lubbock.
Thank you. I guess you could call it that's kind of hinterland.
So what were the interests that were being ignored?
Well, I think the one interest that's mentioned is the economic interest of this group of people, that they had fared less well in a global economy, in a global world. Therefore, they found that they had less hope for themselves, those that had jobs, which most did, but less hopes that these jobs would allow them to rise in American society, less faith and hope that their children, if they had children, would have a better lives than themselves. So it was a kind of feeling of stagnation, and these people were losing out. So then the question becomes, was this just a product of the automation of the world and globalization, or was there something politically that wasn't being done on their behalf? Had we been giving jobs away to others and then treating that as absolutely inevitable? So Trump raised that question. He suggested, of course, that there was something that could be done. And beyond that, this economic element, though, was a cultural element connected to it. First of all, the spread of drugs in the Midwest is an appalling example of what had happened. So there's a good example of something that had been rarely covered by the elites. They had different forms of drugs in the cities, but not the form of drugs that were ravaging these other areas. But beyond that, I would say a cultural element that grew up. That the coastal areas, dominant coastal areas, had different views of what American culture was, American future was, than those who were living in the middle. And phrases that were important in the campaign for Trump, like "You'll say Merry Christmas again," which I think a lot of people thought was either funny or ridiculous, had a lot of resonance. So these people felt forgotten, but disdained by the coast, by coastal culture, by what was happening at our great universities of the East and the West, which, by the way, occupy 80% of the attention inside the major press. It's as if the only existing universities are Harvard, Yale, and Berkeley. But there are other places in the country. But what's happening at those universities was something, I think, foreign to many people living in the Midwest, who, I have to also say, though they cling to their traditional values, we've seen a disintegration of their own family lives in many cases.
So they're truly bitter clingers.
Yeah, I mean, some people are doing fine, but a lot of times this culture is coming apart. So it's not as if you have a fully healthy middle against the different view on the coast.
So it reflects to some degree a real, not only a sense of protest, but a real deterioration of conditions in certain parts of America.
I would say so. And Charles Murray, I think, has done a good job in explaining this and making us aware of it. The hillbilly elegy, of course, that's a little peculiar because it's about a certain group of people who under any circumstances would be regarded as dysfunctional. So it's been overinterpreted, but it does give an indication of what life could be like in these parts of the country. And of course, this isn't everyone, but by no means, but a significant enough part that many people were worried.
And Trump was talking to this, or at least making sort of sympathetic gestures to do this in a variety of ways that other politicians were not.
Absolutely. I think if you look at all the politicians, he was the one that focused in on this, let's say, like a laser beam. Maybe Ted Cruz had a notion of what this group
Bernie Sanders?
Well, Bernie Sanders, when you actually look at his voting patterns, but less than you think. His constituency was college campuses. I know he had a few blue-collar workers that he appealed to, but they went for Trump. And Ted Cruz had some notion of what this group was, but I think he was maybe mistaken in what its final composition was. So Trump was the one who really appealed to this group, and it became decisive for his own election victory.
So does this augur for a new type of American politics, or is it this group's last hurrah and we're going to go on to something else?
Well, the future will have a lot to say about that, but one thing will have to be determined is whether Trump, having won by, say, representing this group, whether he can deliver on his promises to help them. So it's one thing to identify a problem. It's quite another thing to be able to succeed. And this is the question whether he can change their economic outlook, the cultural things as well, but starting with the economic outlook, can he really reverse what had been happening over the last, say, 30 years in American economic development. Can he make jobs better and job prospects better, and prospects in fields other than, let's say, high degree holding occupations? And we'll have to see. He has plans that he's suggested. Some things are going to help everyone, and actually don't just focus on these workers. Things like deregulating the economy, that's supposed to help everyone. I don't think the stock market's that big a thing, but it helps everyone. But he has specific plans in trade and trade policy with other nations, which are kind of a break from much of what the current Republican Party has been, which is plugged into globalization, and immigration, that he thinks that this can actually help their economic prospects. And we'll see. I mean, there's some indications that this has occurred, but 1 year is hardly enough to come to some conclusion about economics, of which I know very little in any case, maybe even less than current economists, Nobel Prize winners.
But you do know about politics. So in order to get this done, you not only have to be moving in the right direction, whatever it is, given the nature of these problems, but you also have to have the kind of political skills and following to be able to get the other branches of government, Congress particularly, to come along with you. How would you say Trump is doing there?
Well, it wasn't great, but this tax cut bill, whatever one thinks of it, was a huge change. And so when you look back over the first year and a half, you say, well, he wasn't able to convince Congress to get rid of Obamacare, which was a disappointment. But I think that's pretty small compared to this tax cut.
Except to get rid of the individual mandate, which
yeah,
he was able to
he
do.
was able to do this administratively, and he's attacking it in a lot of different ways we're not aware of. But he couldn't get the bill through Congress. But this is more important. The tax cut was far more significant. And gee, succeeding in a tax cut of that magnitude is something that a president could be proud of. Any president, good or bad, but any president in a whole term. So in a way, he has his legislative achievements. There may be some other smaller things which keep a form of momentum going, but I don't think changes in the law beyond the tax cut are going to be that important, other than maybe some resolution of the question of immigration.
Mm-hmm. But most of what he's done thus far are probably things that almost any Republican administration with majorities in Congress would have been able to do. It's hard to imagine a Republican administration in that type of situation that didn't enact the tax cut. Almost certainly because it would have been following a Democratic administration that enacted a tax raise of some sort. And of course he's made good judicial appointments from the conservative point of view, but you'd again expect a Republican administration to do that. So has it really, apart from all the sound and fury that has been sort of nonstop throughout the administration's history so far, has it done anything out of the ordinary?
Well, one of the things people expected is that Trump might go completely off the track of the traditional conservative program. This wasn't known before the election outcome. So maybe the surprise is that in many areas he's closer, a lot closer than people think, and has come to rely on Republican programs. Not across the board, there's been some differences. So that could be the significant point. But in those areas where he's in accord with what some other Republicans would do, he's pursued it fairly vigorously, and he doesn't work in the details of everything, but he's pursued it pretty well, or people working under him have, despite all the bluster and everything. So I think that's where we are. People focus on some things where they're worried that his differences from, say, recent Republican orthodoxy might prove disastrous and undo the entire direction that conservative thought had gone in. I'm thinking of trade and the like. On the other hand, maybe he's onto something on trade. We don't know how it's going to actually follow out. Some of these things are parts of negotiation strategies, so he could threaten something and then come to another conclusion. I don't think we know the outcome, or that there may be more to them than we think, or that others have thought. And putting up these new will help workers in this area. So a lot to be determined. But yeah, that's what I think we're at now. No shocking deviations from standard Republicanism in a lot of areas, without the elaboration of Republican political philosophy. That's for sure. There's no theoretical ideas proposed. They're thrown out as individual items that are a good deal, and important, but there's no theoretical underpinning to him. That worries a lot of people, and in that respect, he's a very different kind of politician. But and without the tweets that others would have engaged in, but the actual outcome and product of what he's accomplished is fairly in line.
So one of the sort of dramatic moments, and the media made a great deal of it during the campaign, was when, I guess it was the moderator of one of the debates, asked him whether if he lost, he would accept the outcome of the election. And I think his answer was, well, we'd have to see what the circumstances were, or something to that effect. It doesn't seem in many ways, and perhaps this is unprecedented at any time in prior American history, except perhaps in the 1860 election. There does seem to be a sense in which his opponents have not accepted the full legitimacy of the election. They don't argue that he's not technically the president, but they don't seem to be behaving toward him as oppositions have behaved toward presidents in the past. That is to say, giving some degree of respect to the man in the office simply because he was in the office. What do you make of that?
Well, it's kind of a paradox. I mean, Hillary made a real point trying to get Trump to admit and say that he would accept the outcome of the election.
She would win.
Yeah, she would win, and she wanted that. And of course, therefore, she was on the side of saying the elections are fair. And when the elections ended, suddenly this idea came out, well, he might have won, but he did so by collusion with the Russians. So some Democrats will say it didn't affect the outcome, but they leave the implication that could well have affected the outcome with a small number of differences, so that there is some notion that the election, in their view, was, along with being unwise, tainted. And it's become a central element of what the Democrats have done since today's election, is going after, in some way, the legitimacy of the election process and trying to undermine that
You
outcome.
didn't really see, now, one could have, and there were arguments made about the second Bush's election in 2000, that it was a fishy election because of the intervention of the court, because of the contention that ballots weren't counted in Florida and the results should have been otherwise, and all that stuff. And yet, once Bush was in office, he might not have been very popular with many, and the nature of the election didn't certainly do him any good politically, but nonetheless, there didn't seem to be the concerted effort to destroy him.
Right.
In the same way that we now see on much flimsier ground, it would seem, based on anything that has thus become public. There wasn't the effort to destroy him. So why is this effort to destroy him going on, not only by the Democrats, but by all their friends on the other cultural heights?
Right. Well, one thing about the 2000 election, and this goes back to our election book, there was a kind of effort to try and push Bush to run a nonpartisan presidency, given that he hadn't received the national majority. But quickly he got over that, and I think asserted his role, and people forgot about that. But to get to this election, it has to be said, in fairness, that Trump provokes this. It isn't as if he came after elected that he made a real effort to reach out to the Democrats in many ways. He provokes it, beginning by saying that, of course, he had more people on the mall than any other person in American history, which was not exactly true, easily shown to be false, more than Obama. But he provokes the other side. He finds delight or some strategy in provoking. And the Democrats have taken the bait of this, or they've reacted hostilely to Trump. And this hostility has grown as they've felt themselves insulted in many ways, as they have been, and therefore they won't relent.
Do you think this has worked? I mean, so it doesn't sound as if this was a strategy on Trump's part, it's done him any particular good, in your view. Right?
That's my feeling, but there may be more to it than you think. He may want to show to people that he's a fighter, and I constantly wonder why he doesn't appear more presidential. That may be asking more of him than he's possible as a human being to appear presidential, but to be more accommodating to Democrats, not insult them so directly. So that's my inclination to think this hurts them. But there's another view, which in a way shows that he's in there fighting for them. He's in there fighting for them on every point, and he's not going to allow them to set the show. He's going to be fighting against them. So either one of those, you'd have to be I think, an experienced psychiatrist even to have an opinion on this. But the Democrats, I think, have gotten themselves into a kind of bind on this. That so much of what they do is now predicated on the basis of resistance, and they've made a cause of resistance itself. It's difficult to see how they would stop, or that they want to stop. They have a base in their voting bloc that keeps urging them on, that says that Trump is too stupid to be president. He may have won the election, but somehow or other he's made himself illegitimate by how he's conducted himself. No one should think that he can govern, and they keep pushing in this direction. For example, they win the House in the upcoming midterm elections. It's almost certain there's going to be a big movement towards impeachment or something like that. On what grounds? It's hard to say. And they keep pressing and hoping that the special prosecutor will come up with something. To the point now, as we're speaking, looks like it'd be difficult to get the Secretary of State appointed, where this should be a kind of no-brainer, even if you don't like the person. Generally, you say the president should be able to pick or choose his Secretary of State. So it's resistance to the death. And it would be better, I think, for the country, as much as Trump provokes them, it would be better for the country, I think, if they would back off and act more normally as an opposition party, to bring some normalcy to our politics, and hope that Trump would bring some normalcy to his side.
So you think it would have been different if some somewhat divisive but still better-mannered politician like Ted Cruz had been president? They wouldn't be treating him in this way.
That's my feeling, is that a lot of this has come from it being Trump, what Trump's done, how he's acted, and peculiarities, to say the least, of his personality has continued to provoke the Democrats. From the inaugural address on, that this has made a difference. But that's where they are now, the Democrats, and they can't get off this horse.
Mm-hmm. So one of the great moments in American political history, it's often said, was the election of 1800, because in the election of 1800, power passed peacefully from one party to another. It's true, John Adams left town and didn't attend Jefferson's inauguration, but then Jefferson said, "We are all Democrats, we are all Republicans." Do you have some sense that we're losing that ability to regard the other side as our loyal opposition and cede power to them when they win? Or are we heading toward a kind of more sort of showdown politics in which you really can't tell whether someone will be able to govern if they win the election?
Regrettably, I think so. That we've reached the point, no matter which side you're on, liberal or conservative, looking at it from the outside, that the country's divided, at least the partisans in both parties have divided into two camps. And two camps, one of which looks at the other and says that the other party is illegitimate. Now, that doesn't mean, when they say they're illegitimate, that they're going to go to the streets and try and take over the government by force. But there is a feeling that when you lose, like the Democrats lost, is that they don't really accept the election. They may not overthrow it by force, but they don't accept it. And you talk to them, they can't accept it. They're looking for different ways to neutralize and prevent Trump from governing. And I think the Republicans, leaving aside Trump, if it had an election of Hillary, would be in that position as well. Probably less so than the Democrats for a variety of reasons. They would have felt beaten down and accepted it. They're more closer to the Constitution and elements like that. But the Democrats, I think, are in this position. They think they have a separate source of legitimacy other than a national majority. The national majority they respect in a sense, presidential majority, leave out the numerical majority. They respect the Constitution more or less for for setting the rules of the game. But the idea that the person who won the majority has a proper claim to rule is just not accepted. They're the ones who should rule. So even recently, when Hillary...
Come what may.
Yeah, come what may. They have some source of legitimacy other than the majority. That's what they're coming from. As if you could say, we have a source of legitimacy coming from God or some other source. They have one. And I think it's... you could see this a little bit when Hillary was recently in India selling her book. I don't know how many copies she's going to be selling in India, but the hope springs eternal. But she pointed out that I won, herself, she said, I won the places that are making progress in the country, bringing progress. I was the one who represented the dynamic parts of American society. It's as if the notion of intelligence, dynamism, rational understanding are the real titles to rule. And people who don't possess these things are xenophobic, homophobic, Islamophobic. They're deplorables. And how can you really make an intelligent argument to say that the deplorable should govern?
So some voters are more equal than others, huh?
In their minds, and we all feel this a little bit, but I think for the Democrats it's become a conviction. This is a tendency maybe you're finding across some of the Western democracies all over when you consider populist style revolts in other countries, is that some people feel that by living in the cosmopolitan areas that are developing, that they have a title to rule. After the result of Brexit in England, there was something like this. People figured out the following. They said, well, a lot of the people who voted for Brexit saved their souls, but a lot of the people were older and lived in rural areas. The younger and dynamic parts living in London were for keeping Britain in the European Union. Why should people who won't be around physically, will have died, be able to make decisions for people who will have to experience this decision forever? So ideas were floated about weighting voting. These were, I don't think, got very far, but they were proposed seriously. Shouldn't you weight the vote? But a younger vote should count more than an older vote. Yeah, life expectancy. And behind that is the idea that education should count more than non-education, and so on and so forth, suggesting this despair or disinclination to expect the...
So this is kind of a notion of aristocracy that's making a comeback.
Yeah, aristocracy of a certain kind, or at least I would say rule in the name of rational control. Aristocracy, not in the sense of saying the better should rule all the time because they're better, but some other sort of way of saying the same thing.
Not because of their lineage and descent,
no,
but because of their attributes, which are identifiable in advance. You can tell who these people are. And
yeah. So aristocracy, if you want to use the word, not in the Middle Ages sense.
Sort of Aristotelian,
but Aristotelian view of the best ruling. So there's some of that. I also think that, at least in the United States, that there's this notion that your race and where you stand on race questions matters. So that this middle group of which we spoke, the blue collar, is mostly white, almost entirely white, not by design, but who lives in the Midwest in smaller towns and rural areas, and in a lot of the working class, they happen to be white. That's taken as an attribute of who they are, whereas the people in coastal areas regard themselves as being part of a diverse society, diverse by...
So even the white people there are post-white.
Yeah, they're post-white. I mean, they signal their virtue by saying we're with the minorities against people who consider themselves white, and this links to strange things like how people relate to sometime in the 2040s or 2050s, when the majority of the American population is supposed to reach the point where it becomes the minority.
Right.
And that's celebrated by a lot of people. Won't we have achieved something when we're finally not a majority white country? Because the whites have oppressed the other groups, and now we'll achieve a situation where the majority, physical majority, will consist of minorities, plus now the minority of whites who are on their side. I think a lot of people look at politics this way in the United States, and don't want to cede what they believe power to a white majority, which they say considers itself white, thinks in terms of race. I think there's a lot of exaggerations in that, but the call of racism is brought up very
So
frequently.
is whiteness in this case a kind of emblem for the past? That is to say, for the past of America, for the past of the West, for all the things that our new elites want to rise above and remake. I mean, that this is a kind of revolutionary attitude, which rather than talking about overthrowing the bourgeois, now talks about, overthrowing what is associated with the traditional population of America and the West.
Yes, I think definitely, and you see this on college campuses. College campuses, there's not that many votes on college campuses, but they sometimes show a direction in which many are going, and certainly many intellectuals in the Democratic Party are in that position. When you go on some of the leading college campuses, the idea is that the whites have oppressed for all these centuries, so now it's time, in the name of making things right, to reverse this situation and get the true majority, the right majority to be in charge. And this affects more than many think the real debate, I think, over immigration in the United States. It's not such a question of numbers or whether the people here will need more aid from the state or less, or whether we need more workers of a certain age. I think the Democrats, aside from hoping to get a lot more votes from immigrants, that many of the Democrats are saying this is a way to speed up the change in the population composition in favor of the minorities, and that's pretty important for them. They celebrate the fact that they can live with minorities and prosper with minorities, and they feel better in that circumstance.
So if all these newcomers of various backgrounds were likely to vote Republican, I think they'd think twice.
I would think they'd think 3 times or 4 times. And of course, this is inevitable in this situation. We have more people wanting to come from these countries that are in the southern hemisphere and whatnot. But above and beyond that issue, I think it's the fact that more of them are, in the American cases, are brown, meaning Indian origin. Because it's not the people that came from Spain in Mexico City. We're talking now about brown people, and this is very important to them.
So, I mean, this sort of sounds to me like a revolutionary situation. You have a group of folk who are sort of leading a political cause, and unlike actually most revolutionary situations, they're already very powerful. It's not as if they're sort of out on the streets trying to break their way in. They're in the commanding heights in most respects already. But they want to carry through a great transformation and bring forth something kind of new under the sun that in many respects will repudiate what the tradition, the traditional values and institutions and religion of America and the West is held dear. I don't think there's ever been a moment in American history, at least, in which anything like that has been true. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, this question over the course of American history is complicated, but I would say yes. I mean, the irony today is those who are leading this, you call it a revolution, let's say this movement in favor of minorities or diversity. Most of the ones who are at the head of it are still white, but they're whites in a way to apologize for that and associate with these groups, and
but don't themselves feel guilty. They feel themselves empowered.
Empowered, right? Yeah, but guilty about being representatives of whites with whom they don't want to really feel close to. So they're leading the revolution. Somewhat as if, like the intellectuals, going back to the Marxian element, the intellectuals lead the party for the workers. That's the temporary situation. And in Europe, it would be people who are apologetic for being colonialists. They feel they colonized unjustly the countries of.
Why are the Swedes so apologetic? What did they colonize?
Well, they wanted to, I guess, as the Icelanders did in the right. But
they're apologetic for being Vikings, perhaps, or something like that.
Yes, that's true. And going back to the issue of race and everything related to that, it is true that you go back to the early parts of the the 20th century and into the 19th century, and no one conceived of few conceived of the whites as being one race. Many put great emphasis on the differences among its constituent branches. So people from Ireland really weren't regarded as true stock. The Anglo-Saxon was the true stock, and so on. So there was a lot of conflict temporary conflict on this, but it faded. And I'm not so sure when you actually get down to this that this idea of the country becoming minority majority is going to make any difference when you get down to it. Does the people who come from Mexico really feel themselves racially oppressed in the United States, and don't they intermarry with the white classes, especially in areas where there's not a predominant Hispanic majority? And look at especially people from India and people from East Asia. Do they remain pure to their race, or do they misogynize rather easily? Spent a lot of time in California, a couple years, and observed dating patterns of people on campuses, and all sorts of intermixing. So it could be that this idea that the Democrats have constructed won't make any difference by the time we get to 2040, and more people will be like Tiger Woods and the like, and overlook these things that now look essentially different. But it's a kind of ideological construct, as you pointed out. Maybe not really the race itself, but what's supposed to stand for is that the whites were dominant. Now it's time for them to become subordinate.
So if you don't think that that's a fair indictment, if one wants to kind of restore the status not of whites, but rather of traditional American and Western institutions and values, how, given the place we're now in, does one best go about doing that?
Well, that's a long project, but to be sure, your program is one example. And your program, it says, is your program Western civilization or just civilization?
Western.
Yeah. I mean, this idea of just defending one civilization, it could be kind of extreme. One would want to look at civilizations per se. So it's not just as if you're only for the West, but Western civilization is a way of, in a way, looking back to the past and to the important books.
I would argue Western civilization is global civilization.
Well, that would be a way of looking at it, and others would have another view. So there is a way that could be a problem, but people would have to. Education would be one aspect of this. So the things that people have accomplished in the West, despite the faults that have gone along with this, have to be regarded as accomplishments and something to be respected. So even if someone did A, B, and C, and D, colonized, held slaves, didn't allow women to vote, you name it, all these things go along with the West. At the same time, they gave us so much of what we have today. So how do you hold people who lived 100 or 200 years accountable for every error, which, after all, other civilizations had even worse?
Didn't allow anyone to vote.
That's right. They had slavery as well, and women suffered from a horrible position of inferiority in Islamic lands, and so on and so forth. So this isn't a real look at our history, but it's taken very seriously, and people feel guilty about this, and that the only way to right it is to forget your past. I'm interested a lot in America's founding and the founding period, and this great period at the beginning when Americans set up a new way of constituting politics in the West and in the world. I think it was, people ask what's great about America, and often the answer is the technology, the planes, the cars that we invented. But I think the real greatness of America was in its political understandings and political revolution that took place with that generation of people between, say, 1775 and 1800. The best minds in America, after all of that period, were focused on politics. They were able to study politics through the different phases. They participated in politics. Now our great minds are in science or whatnot, but that's what they studied and knew. I think they knew it better than any generation of people who has ever lived, and put it to good use. So one would have to go back to and look at that period of American history and be able to appreciate it. But when people do go back, they also take the flaws of that period, and they raise those to a higher level.
Right. Well, any observer can kind of pick and choose.
Pick and choose,
And
exactly.
if you take a look at what's largely taught in many fields, it's the negative side. It's all the things that we should be trying to overcome and put
Right.
behind us. So
If it's taught at all.
if it's taught at all,
Yes.
right? This says something about our intellectual classes, not only in the United States but in the Western world as well. Why are they so adversarial to what you and I, at least, would think are these great gifts of the past, of the Enlightenment, of the notion of liberal constitutionalism? Why the notion of freedom in general? Why are they so jaundiced in their view of these things? Or
Hard to say, but it might be that the dominant idea of modernity in the West now is equality. Not equality of outcome, but some notion of all human beings being equal, and therefore examples in the past in which there was deviations from equality are held to be cardinal sins, and that the wave of the future is to make sure that we have full equality, and we haven't achieved that. And the groups that continue to want to maintain something of, let's say, the American tradition, align themselves in some way with forms of inequality. And the future belongs to those who stand for true equality, notwithstanding the fact that, as I mentioned right at the beginning, you have large groups of people thinking that they should govern because in a way they're unequal. But that's even in the name of equality. That's what's kind of interesting.
they don't live equally either. I mean,
no, not at
they're
all.
well off.
They're well off.
Sometimes
Yeah.
spectacularly so,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
have great jobs if they're professors.
But you ask them what's moving them, and they don't say what's moving them is I'm in a condition where I can rightfully claim myself as a ruler of others. They say, in effect, let us rule so that we can make everyone more equal.
So why don't they say, as my colleagues here, we have a Free Market Institute on campus, a sort of in some ways a sister program to the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. And if you ask the people associated with that, who are credentialed academics, they would say, my desire is that people be free. So why doesn't the intellectual class at large, or much more than it at least does now, embrace that as their motivating goal?
You mean freedom rather than equality?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Equality, I think, is the
Why is that?
is the dominant.
Why? But
dominant
why?
factor.
But why? Why have they gone in that direction?
Yeah, because it'd be conceivable that you can imagine a world where all would be free and equal.
Right.
You could also imagine a world where only some would be free in a condition of inequality. So the first alternative is in a way superior. You can be free and equal. So in the Middle Ages and so you had a group that was free, even though they sometimes enslaved others, but they themselves were free. That's not sufficient for the humanitarian world of the future, where if there's going to be freedom, people have to be equal, and you can't exclude any group. No group can be excluded from this.
But presumably there's a recognition that if you want to make people equal, you have to limit their freedoms.
You'd think.
Well, and certainly a lot of recent 20th century
Right.
and even more lately experience that shows that that's where you go if you have the goal of absolute equality. So how come that lesson doesn't get through?
Yeah, well, I mean, it would be possible to have a society in which all were free and equal, something like that.
And everybody were clones, or
No, not fully equal in a sense of not having different amounts, but respected as equals and accorded their dignity, and all would be citizens, and all.
Well, that's kind of what we have.
Yeah, that's
though,
kind of
isn't
what
it?
we aspire to have. So,
and largely do have it, I would say.
I would.
Imperfections, but
Yeah.
we've come closer to that than
Then
most other places have.
I suppose we have, yeah. But what was the
Well, why don't they see that if you really want equality thoroughgoing, you're going to have to limit
Yeah.
freedom. You could see that both logically and you could see that both experientially. Why don't they see it?
Yeah, if freedom and equality, if it meant equal outcomes, which people, even those who
Right.
defend equality, don't say we have to have fully equal outcomes. But more equal outcomes is important to them. So the important thing I think in this is that they confuse the ideas of freedom and equality, and they call much of what results in equality, moves towards equality, they call that freedom. The words have changed their meaning.
Sort
So,
of
for example,
Orwellian type of
yeah,
thing.
redistributing income, if you want to use income, is not regarded as taking and giving. It's regarding as making people, in a sense, more equal and free. And the
from
whole
what?
rational state that we have created in the United States to improve the conditions at the expense of a free, open civil society, that's regarded not as a movement towards freedom, but a movement towards equality, which is considered making more people free. There are lots of people in this view who aren't free enough because they're without certain things.
So perhaps intellectuals kind of like this idea because they see themselves as the arbiter of what people rightfully should have in a dispensation in which you are kind of giving to those who need and taking from those who have too much. They imagine that they or people like themselves who they can identify with are going to have the power to do that.
Right. The question in this case would be whether in doing this, people are, in the end, after all this has taken place, people are in the end equal and free. Yeah, but I think that they take these two terms and refuse to see that movements in this direction would in fact impinge on people's freedom.
Mm-hmm.
They call that equality and freedom rather than sacrificing one at the expense of the other. I could see a movement of people who would say, as you said, it's much more important that people be equal than free.
Mm-hmm.
But we put the two together, and as we introduce more and more controls on more and more aspects of society, no one ever says that this is making us less free. They never say it's making us more free.
But you don't want to give up on equality. I mean, there's certain kinds of equality that are part of the American ideal and have been from the first.
Yes.
I mean, I think when Jefferson was saying all men are created equal, probably what he had in mind is that we don't have castes. We don't have people who, by descent, can claim superior privilege as if they were given that by God or something. So he was making an equality claim. It might have been the notion of a floor. You can rise in the world, but it's not because you have special privileges. It's going to be because you've earned it in some way. That's an important part of equality, and certainly not one that we can take for granted. But it doesn't seem to be enough for our leading lights today.
Right, and maybe it's not enough. Maybe one would say that it's time or necessary to limit our freedom for certain goals of equality, to make that distinction clear, that there's a kind of trade-off. My point, I guess, is to try and say is that as we move towards or press for policies of greater equality or eliminating greater inequalities, we never say that that's a sacrifice of freedom. We always say it's bringing more freedom. That's, I think, the dangerous part. We should at least be aware of the trade-offs that exist between the two.
Well, you make it sound like there's sort of an inevitable march toward taking more equality and giving up freedom to do so. If we're going to, if we don't think that this is a healthy direction in which to proceed, and we want to turn it around, we want to change the climate of ideas, and we're intellectuals, we're talking to other intellectuals. What kind of arguments can we make at this stage of the game? They've all been made, it would seem to me.
Yes, I suppose that's true. I suppose that's so, but yeah.
What would if the people who created the American Republic came forward and traveled through time to the present and had a chance to kind of sit down with us and speak to us today, having learned what our situation and challenges are, what do you think they'd say?
Well, that's a time machine is difficult to imagine, but you could imagine being presented with the current situation as some see it, in which the natural tendency of events is towards growing inequality, permanent growing inequality.
Sort of Charles Murray type.
Charles Murray sort of thing. Classes that not having a sanctioned legal status, but in fact exist. The intelligent marry the intelligent. They have children who are intelligent. The others suffer in this condition of a downward spiral. You could imagine them looking at the founders looking at this and saying this isn't a tolerable situation, either from the point of view of justice or from the point of view of continuity, that it's not going to be able to continue, and therefore there's going to have to be changes made in our understanding of freedom. That there's going to have to be efforts to redistribute things in a certain way.
That brings us back to a larger sense of community in which we want to make sure that our less fortunate brothers and sisters don't fall hopelessly behind.
Something like that, and that would be so. I would say that we should understand that all the changes that are going to be made in this direction, many of them, will come at the expense of a certain kind of freedom. They might be necessary, they might not, but we can't live under the illusion that they're not impinging on our freedom.
And you think, in some sense, that if not the message of the time machine traveling founders, is the message of the 2016 Trump victory?
In the sense of, explain the...
Well, that the message communicated is that we have to begin to think about these opening fissures in civil society between the kind of left outs and the coastal elites.
That's one element of it. I mentioned the cultural element too, that I think is just as important. But also, many in the class that voted for Trump are of the view that their condition is not a natural condition of the evolution of the economy, as everyone said, but a deliberate effect of government policies which haven't protected them. So they would be inclined to say, whether true or not, that their problems that they're suffering are due to unfair trade agreements rather than just the trade agreements, and that the global economy is not necessary in its current form. So they tend to think of the steps that would be taken to advance them can be done by government and aren't impingements on their freedom.
Right, it's sort of government retracting the kind
of
unfair burdens.
And you don't find these people asking for government for great programs of redistribution,
like that,
not openly.
Yeah.
They're not making a claim that we have to change the entire society by taking from some and giving to others.
Sort of like the Civil War veterans who wanted, through the Grand Army or the Republic Veterans Benefit, they wouldn't have thought of that as welfare, but it was what they were deserved for having saved the country. And maybe they did, right. Yeah.
Maybe they did.
So just sort of to end here, we have an election coming up. Forget about the midterms, though they'll obviously be interesting and maybe bear, crucially, on the 220 presidential elections. What do you think we're going to be faced with when you were going to write the book in 220? What do you think that book will be about?
I'm not sure I'm going to write one in 220. I may have retired with 216, but right now, as looking at it right now, and lots could change in 2 or 3 years with these experiments and how they work out. It looks like the Democrats have in mind a candidate of the left of their party, rather than someone who's what we would call a moderate or centrist Democrat. And so you could take your pick of who it would be: Booker, Elizabeth Warren. So, but one of that type, or Bernie Sanders, if he's still here. But of that,
gives hope to us all, doesn't it?
It does, eternal life. But of that ilk, that they have the grip looks now on the Democratic elite and on the Democratic Party, something which could change, but they're the dominant force. Versus, if we imagine that Trump presents himself running for another term, that would be the alternative. And in that outcome, in that election, I'm not sure that the Democrats can count on winning at all. So with all the things, 100,000 things that could happen between now and 2020, that would be, I think, the place that we're at now. When you ask, there are a lot of people that are dissatisfied with Trump or don't like the way he's being president and so on down the line. But when you put the question in another light, which comes with an election, would you prefer Trump to Elizabeth Warren? It's not clear at all to me that Elizabeth Warren would have a clear and natural majority. Then everything would look different. The question is not whether you like or dislike Trump in the abstract, but how is Trump situated compared to another alternative? So he can have that to look forward to. If he's still president and hasn't been impeached and all those things, he'll be a lot older himself by that time as well.
Well, even if you have retired, we'll have you back again at that time, and we can talk about this further. Thank you very much for being with us. It's been
Thank you,
very
Steve.
enlightening and enjoyable. And thank you all.